Welcome to Codex, a history of video games. My name is Tyler Osby.
And I'm Mike Coletta.
And this week, we are covering fighting games. This is something we haven't covered on the show before, or at least not in any sort of detail. And so Mike has taken it upon himself to give us a rough history of at least the early fighting game scene. The games themselves. I don't know if there was a scene until the 90s. But
yeah, so this is an interesting one. So before we get started, a couple caveats to this. There's so many fighting games.
Oh my gosh, just so many.
So many. And so we're going to cover essentially the games that I think were like a first in something. I think that's a good way of putting it. And also, I've kind of revised the grime facts for this. Really, we're just talking developer, year, and system because these games are so old. There's no Metacritic score and there's no sales data. And I kind of will talk about their major achievement or what they put forward to the genre while I talk about them.
Okay, and it's also like the fighting games as they are today is very different than what they were, and also it's hard to say where the modern fighting game started, especially with a genre title like fighting. Like, I mean, that could be any game almost, right? That has fighting in it. You call Mario a fighting game if you say he's fighting Goombas, right? So,
yeah, that's very true. And there's also a caveat to this too. So, my definition of fighting games is any game where the player character fights a computer or other player using any type of weapon. Notice how broad that is.
That's very broad.
And that's because the early fighting games, beat 'em ups, were fighting games. There was no different, the genre of beat 'em up and fighting games were just melded together. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of why it's so open. And we'll definitely see it close in when I start talking about mainline games that we all know and love. And this is going to be probably a 2-part episode. So this is just part 1 because there's just so many and I wanted to give them at least their due diligence, but this is going to be fast. We're going to go through 20 games today.
Lightning round of games.
Yeah.
Love it.
And so if you like this and you enjoy it, let us know. If you don't like it and instead like it when we take 2 or 3 games and go very slowly through them, then tell us and let us know that. For reference though, I used a YouTube video called Fighting Game History Episode 1 by Magister Faber, which is it's a good video because it shows just snippets of each game going through. And then to fill out the rest of the list, I found a website called hardcoregaming101.net. And they actually had a lot of info that I couldn't find from that video. They actually had developers and years and systems they were on. Whereas some of the other websites, a lot of these games don't even have a Wikipedia page. They're just really old.
That's how old and not remembered they are.
Yeah. So Hardcore Gaming 101, and they have an entire, I don't know if it's an article, but if you just Google pre-Street Fighter 2 fighting games, then you'll see the list that I'm working off of. And notice pre-Street Fighter 2 because there are eras to fighting games. And so we're covering before Street Fighter 2 where really everything changed. And then I think after the Street Fighter 2 era, we're probably going to be talking by series like we usually do. So this is only going to last for 2 parts where we're talking about a ton of games like this. So I think we should just get started. Are you ready?
Yeah,
Tyler?
Take me through it. I don't know anything about fighting games. This is not a genre I really have any knowledge on at all outside of Street Fighter 2 was a popular one.
Yeah. Didn't they have a turbo mode? That's what it was.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. So, Hyper Fighting Super Mega Remix, I remember, came out in 2008, and that's really all I know.
Yeah, so the first game actually is not really a fighting game. It's a jousting game. It's called Knights in Armor. It was developed by Project Support Engineering in 1976. And it only came out on arcade. And we're going to have pretty much only arcade games for the first,
gotcha.
I don't know, 10 games or so. And we're not going into too much detail on this one. It's a fighting game, but not really what we have in the modern era. But the reason it's important is because it's the first fight, between 2 players, you're jousting each other. So it's
it looks like if Pong were a jousting game.
Exactly. That's a great... I should have just written that down. That's a great definition. Second game, little more famous. It's called Heavyweight Champ. It was developed by Sega. It was released on October 1976. There's no specific number to how many sales that this game had, but there was a note in the notes I found that on the first annual Game Machine arcade chart, so we're talking the first time they've actually tracked sales records of arcade
Game
games.
Machine arcade chart.
Yeah, Heavyweight Champ was the third highest grossing arcade game in 1976 in Japan, just below Taito's Ballpark, which is also known as Tornado Baseball, and then Speed Race DX. It's a boxing game, Heavyweight Champ, and this is to many people the first true fighting game. Like, this is what you think of when you think of two people, side view perspective, they're fighting. Like, this is a fighting game. And the cool thing about this one is they actually had boxing glove controllers on the arcade machine, and they moved up and down for like high and low punches, which I thought was pretty cool. It also used like monochrome sprite visuals for the graphics, and it was actually remade in 1987. So then then they moved in 1987. They actually moved the perspective to behind the boxer's head to be like another famous fighting game that we're going to talk about at the end of this episode called Punch-Out, which I think a lot more people are familiar with. All right, moving on. Like I said, it's going to be fast. Warrior. This was developed by Tim Skelly and Vector Beam at first, and then Vector Beam was bought out by Cinematronics, so they're the ones that released the game. It was released in July of 1979. It's an arcade game, and this is actually a really cool history here. Tim Skelly worked under Larry Rosenthal, who had built Space War. Space War! Yeah, so they have the very similar vector graphics like that, and this is important because this game is the first ever one-on-one fighting game. Not jousting, but fighting. And in Warrior, it's pretty cool. Like, you're holding swords, and there's like pits you can fall in, and you're two armored knights, and you like go fight each other. It's a fighting game, but it's from the top down perspective. Also, it's one of those early games too, where the environment, quote unquote, is just an overlay that's on the screen.
Oh, like the old Magnavox Odyssey. Like, oh, it's tennis now. Put the tennis plastic on your TV.
Mm-hmm. Yep, exactly. Which I think it's a kind of cool.
It's creative. That's like, yeah, it's neat.
All right, now we're moving on to an RPG. Like I said, it's going to get kind of weird in this episode. This is called Dragon's Eye. It's developed by Southern Software in 1981. Now we're kind of seeing some different systems here. This was on the Apple II, the Atari 8-bit, and the Commodore PET. And Dragon's Eye is an RPG, but this was like one of the first games to feature dueling fights in the side perspective.
Okay.
Like, they had it in the Heavyweight Champ, but this one kind of looked just, with the environment, it looked a lot more like a fighting game, but it was an RPG. But now, the first pure fighting game, as it's called, with a side view, is called Swashbuckler. It's pirate themed. And it was developed by Data Most in 1982, and it was on the Apple II, the PC-88, the FM7, which are these computers? I think they are. The Panasonic GR200U. That sounds like a computer.
They must be. Obviously I recognize Apple II. PC-88, I'm pretty sure is just a PC, a computer, but I've never heard of the FM7 or the Panasonic GR200U. Now I want to Google these.
Yeah, and Swashbuckler is kind of like a fencing game more than anything. If you look at it, it's also definitely kind of a beat 'em up, like enemies come from either side and you're like fencing in the middle of them, which is, it's a fighting game though. It's definitely a fighting game by our definition, which like everything is at this point. I'm sure you could argue that like Galaga or whatever is a fighting game, I guess, by this standards.
Every game is a fighting game.
Yeah. All right. We got two games with the same name coming up. So this is the 1980 game Boxing by Activision. It was on the Atari 2600. It is a top-down boxing game that really influenced the whole one-on-one fighting genre, but it's very simplistic by today's standards. There were no knockouts. You scored points for each hit, and the first to 100 wins. The games could end in a tie if the timer ran out. And the way it was scored is long punches were 1 point, and the shorter power punches, where you had to be closer to the opponent, were 2 points. But the cool part about this boxing game on the Atari is while it was simple, there were like subtle strategies to it. Like, you could push your opponent onto the ropes to get like an advantage. So even though, like, you'll look at this game, Google this game, and you'll see how simple it looked, and you'll be like, oh, but there's actually more to it than just like they look like Mr. Game & Watch figures, like punching each other from the top view.
They do. That's a great way to describe it. Yeah. Wow.
So, all right. So the next game is also called Boxing. If this couldn't get more confusing. This is back in the era where they had games that were just named after what they were. For example, we're not going to there yet, but the next game is just called Karate. But this is Boxing, the second game called Boxing. This was developed by Mattel. It was released on October 21st, 1981. It was on the Intellivision console. It is the first game with multiple characters with different moves to select.
Ooh.
Boxing also allowed each player to select these boxer characters that had different strengths and weaknesses. So not only multiple characters, but these boxers had like not only different moves, but they were just different in general, like stats. They had stats.
Wow, we're getting into RPG territory here.
Yeah, and to start the game, one must select a fighting speed. So that's kind of the difficulty. Kind of like Mario Kart has 50cc, 100cc, and 150cc. Mm-hmm. Just think about that, but with a fighting game. So there were fighting speeds. And the game plays, this is the crazy part, it goes until someone is knocked out, or until, like real boxing at the time, 15 rounds.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, you're boxing. When you play Mattel's Boxing, you are committed to
You're
boxing.
in it for the long haul.
Yeah, you are there. But yeah, just like the theme of going with games that are just named after what they are, Karate is the next game. And this was developed by Ultravision. It was released in 1982. It is for the Atari 2600. And this is actually the first game that represents a martial arts competition. So we're kind of getting closer here, you know, because I would argue that fighting games now based very much on martial arts more than boxing, obviously. But the first game with multiple fighting moves. So there's 4 different moves here. And actually, you know what? I'm thinking about this. The more I think about it, the more I think this like list I went off of was wrong, because I just said in the last boxing game that there were different fighting moves. So maybe this is the first martial arts game with multiple fighting moves, I guess is a better way to put it. And while this is on the list, it's important to note that in 1991, a article was released by Digital Press, and they said that Karate, this game on the Atari 2600, was one of the worst Atari 2600 games of all time.
Wow, right up there with E.T., huh?
Yeah, it's like E.T. and then Karate. So if you wanted to get a bit of fighting history, I highly suggest you don't play this one. You play a different game.
It was not the source of inspiration for the Karate Kid, I understand.
No, it was not. It was not good for that. The next game, though, I think has one of the best names of a game I've heard in a long time. And it's called Sword Fight at Midnight.
Oh, it rhymes.
Yeah, it's got a cool name. This was developed by Mark Harmon. It's just one guy, and he released it in 1983 for the ZX Spectrum. And
you should say this is not the same Mark Harmon from NCIS, right?
No, it is not.
Harmon?
This is his evil twin brother that makes ZX Spectrum games, I guess. But yeah, so this is pretty cool, though, because this is a beat-em-up game. So it's not really new like any of the other games at this time, but this is the first fighting game with a replay mechanic.
Oh, so you could watch again and like sort of study what you did and try to do better?
Yeah, you can fight guys. It's a fencing game, just like the one before the Swashbuckler one was. But this one, after you are defeated or you're done playing, you could watch your replay, which I think is a really cool thing, especially like that's in 1983.
That's impressive.
Yeah, very early. All right. This next game also might have one of the greatest names in early video gaming. The Attack of the Phantom Karate Devils.
Whoa, that sounds intense.
It does sound intense. It's developed by John Orthel and Phantom Software. It was released in 1983. The system it was on is the Commodore 64. This is another beat 'em up, and like I said before, there's a lot of these. Like we're going to be talking about beat 'em ups and fighting games in the same vein until the genres are more established. The first martial arts game, though, this is the first martial arts game to include projectile weapons, which is pretty big. According to the developer, it's the first fighting game on a home computer system, but we all know that is not true. Yeah, that's just what the developer thinks. I read that quote and I'm like, I'm going to include this because this guy's really tooting his horn when he doesn't know what he's talking about. So The one fun thing about this game, like interesting fun fact about the attack of the Phantom Karate Devils, is a lot of people thought the final stage was broken, but it turns out John Orthel purposefully designed the stage that way. And
okay.
I don't know.
That seems like something you'd say after the final stage ended up being broken. Be like, no, I meant to do that.
Okay, I'm 100% not the only person that thinks that then. That's good to know, because I didn't want to say it, but I'm like, if other people are thinking it, I think that's fine. All right, moving right along. Rocky Super Action Boxing.
Wow.
This game was developed by
Licensed?
John. Yep, this is actually the first licensed fighting game.
Wow.
You beat me to it, Tyler, but it's developed by John G. Avildsen for Coleco because it came out in 1983 on the ColecoVision. And if we recall, Coleco made a lot of their own games. Yep, it's the first licensed fighting game. It's based on Rocky 3. You can play as Rocky Balboa or Clubber Lang, either one of those two. And the fun part about this is if you're just a big Rocky fan, you could just watch a CPU match and just watch these two characters fight. It's just a fun thing to do, you know? If you wanted to gamble on it with friends in your living room, you could do that.
Let's just put it up on Twitch and start taking bets.
Yeah, exactly. Players also, important to note here, so you're in a boxing ring, and you can move up and down vertically. There's like 3 rows. If you picture it like a 3x3 grid, you can move up, and you can move over, and you can move down and to the left. Like, it's like that. So there's movement up and down on a weird perspective. I don't know if I explained that really well, but just watch a video. If you're confused, watch a video. You'll be like, oh, that's what Mike was trying to say. And then you'll think of a better way to say it. And then you'll email me and tell me. And that's nice. Okay. So next game is Tag Team Wrestling. It was also known as The Big Pro Wrestling. This was developed by Technos Japan, and they developed a lot of games coming up. But this is important because this was their first fighting game. And it came out in 1983 on arcade. It was ported to a lot of other consoles. And the cool part about this game is the tag team perspective. The tag team gameplay. So their mechanic here is you could be fighting in wrestling, and then you can go tag out, and the character you were just fighting with would recover strength while they're on the side of the ring.
Oh,
so
like
the
Marvel
matches,
versus Capcom.
Yeah, the matches would last a little longer, which is kind of cool.
That's cool.
All right. So, actually, this kind of still applies. These are two different. I figured this out. These are two different games, what I'm about to say, but they have very similar names. Not as bad as Boxing and Boxing, but the first one is called Super Black Belt Karate. It came out on the Commodore 64 in 1983 and was developed by a company called Computer Applications. It's computer : applications, which might be... I mean, yeah, I guess that's what you do, but that's just a really not creative name for a studio.
Yeah, that's a really dumb name.
Yeah, Computer Applications. I make cars. I am a car manufacturer. That's the company name.
That's the company name, car manufacturer.
So this game is unique because it was one of the first games to have different backgrounds, like different stages. Other than that, though, it's pretty bad. Like, it's pretty well noted that this game has really difficult controls to get your head around. It does look like this is kind of what I pictured old versions of like Street Fighter to look like, though. So I would do some Google image searching of Super Black Belt Karate, and you'll be like, oh yeah, that's definitely a fighting game. But it's really, the backgrounds were cool, but that's about all it really brings to the table as far as what's unique. But I think it's important because I know, like, especially with like Smash Brothers, we all have like our favorite stages. So, Okay. Developed, this next game was called Black Belt. It's just Black Belt here. It was developed by Kevin Ryan of Earthware Computer Services.
That's a good name.
Yeah, that's a way better name than Computer Applications. It was released in 1984. It's kind of like if we just called our podcast Video Game Podcast.
Yeah.
Which I'm tempted now. Video Game, podcast. Okay, sorry. So Black Belt, developed by Kevin Ryan, released in 1984 on the Commodore 64 and Apple II. This is important because this is the first game based on Taekwondo. Because Black Belt is notable as the first game ever to be made also with expert input from a real martial artist. Kevin Ryan apparently consulted with his Taekwondo instructor as to what the game should look like and what the moves should look like.
Very cool.
And this is also one of the first fighting games with a practice mode. Although it's funny to note because there's a practice mode, but it showed you the moves, but not the button combinations of how to do them. So you had to kind of figure it out.
Here's what's possible. Figure it out.
Exactly. That's exactly a way to put it. Here's what you could do. Now have at it. Figure it out. So that was Black Belt by Kevin Ryan. And it's a pretty notable game because I think first Taekwondo game is really cool and that they're actually getting input from like a real martial artist. So I felt like it was pretty important to include on the list here. So the next game, and this one we have a lot more info on because it is probably one of the bigger fighting games. It's called Karate Champ. And in Japan, it's known as Karate Do, The Way of the Empty Hand, which is a great name. That is a really cool name. It's developed by Technos Japan, those same people that did the tag team wrestling game before. And this was released on arcades in 1984. It came out on the Virtual Console on Wii in 2010. And then it was also released on these Arcade Archives games that came out in 2014 and 2015. They're kind of just collections of arcade games. But sales-wise, this game was a huge hit. In Japan, Game Machine listed Karate Champ on their August 1st, 1984 issue as being the second most successful table arcade unit of the month. And then it became the top grossing arcade table unit in August 15th, 1984. So just like 14 days later, it got really big. It's also the sixth most successful table arcade unit in that month. And in North America, it was the fourth top grossing upright arcade cabinet on the monthly replay charts in November 1985. I kind of want to know, like, the business of charting arcade success in the 80s.
Yeah, because are they going off of like cabinet sales or are they going off of like, that's a really great question because cabinet sales are probably a decent indicator at the start, but like as arcades start to get their cabinets, they stop buying them, obviously. So I guess you need like whoever's coming by to sort of take the quarters out of the machine needs to count it, or maybe they're relying on arcades to like report how well their machines are doing. Like, I don't know. That's really weird because I guess I don't know the business of arcades, but I assume that when you buy an arcade machine, it's your arcade machine and you get to keep all of the money that gets put into it. But maybe not. Maybe you give a portion to in like royalties. I don't know.
I know there's like the businesses now. I know is you can also lease machines from companies and then you split the profits and it's a little bit cheaper. But back then, I think you were buying the cabinets and then it would be like your arcade cabinet. So I'm guessing it is on sales of the cabinets they're going off of here. But another thing about this game too is on home computers, it was very successful. The floppy disk actually by 1989 sold over 500,000 units.
Wow,
so
that's pretty good.
One of the top best-selling computer games in the United States until June of 1989, and it was only beaten by Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego. So it was a pretty popular computer game in the late 80s.
That's a classic game, Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's kind of... I want to do an educational games episode, and that's like one of the big reasons why.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is actually considered a martial arts fighting game. It is... They kind of created so many things that modern fighting games use today. So I feel like we should just break it down. They were 1v1 fighting. They used two joysticks so the player could execute 24 different moves. They introduced the 3-match system that secured a win. They had training and bonus stages. The 1v1 was computer based at first, and then they came out with a game called Karate Champ Player versus Player. And that was released in 1984 and is an updated version of the game that included two real people playing and fighting each other.
Nice.
Also updates to this version included new stages and a judge that actually says begin and winner behind you, which is kind of neat. The gameplay consisted of a 2-dimensional fight between two different people. There's one in a white gi and the second one is wearing a red gi. And they're controlled by the player or the CPU. I mean, if you got the extra version, the updated version, you could play with 2 people. But unlike later fighting games, though, there's no health bar or hit point system. So, like, you land a hit successfully landed, like, ends the round and earns the hitter like a point or a half a point. It's kind of actually like a real martial arts match in that way. It's not like...
I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's the first person to score 2 points is the winner. So, and then you have the cool judge like saying winner or fight, which is kind of neat. And that kind of is going to be carried over. That judge is like, in Mortal Kombat, it's like fight, like the judge is off screen, which is kind of neat. So that's a really big game. If you're like really into the history of fighting games, I highly suggest just watching videos of Karate Champ because you'll see it and you'll be like, oh, that's like early Street Fighter. Like you'll see that, So moving on Karateka is a game that was developed by Jordan Mechner of Broderbund, which I think is a great name for a studio, in 1984 on the Apple II. And Karateka is important because Jordan Mechner would later go on to create Prince of Persia. So I just thought it'd be kind of cool to like include that in the list because, hey, he's going to be famous one day. And he started in fighting games in 1984. So another game in 1984 is Kung Fu. This was on the ZX Spectrum, and it was developed by Bug-Byte. And it is the first fighting game on the ZX Spectrum, like true fighting game. And this game also had a replay option, which I thought was cool.
Nice.
So I think that was kind of, because if I recall, look at my list, Sword Fight at Midnight is also on the ZX Spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. So I wonder if that like mechanic is something very exclusive to the ZX Spectrum. Like if other computers and other hardware couldn't do it at the time.
Yeah, maybe it has some kind of help inside the computer that lets a developer easily implement something like that. It'd be interesting to hear about.
Yeah, I'm curious now. I gotta look into that. Okay, so Great Swordsman. So this game is actually really cool. It's developed by Illumor, and it was released in 1984, and it's an arcade game. But it's also Taito's first arcade game they ever published. Like first fighting arcade game, not first arcade game. And it's kind of cool because Great Swordsman is actually 3 different styles of sword fighting. There's fencing, kendo, and gladiator. And you can do high attacks, low attacks, or mid attacks. And there are actually bonus levels in the game where you can deflect arrows. It's a fighting game, loosely, and I'm mostly including it because it's Taito's first fighting game, and they are a very big arcade company for a while. But it is like one of those ones that's on the border, you know, of like, is this really relevant? So next game, though, is important because it's developed by Nintendo. It's called Urban Champion. It came out in 1984 on the NES. It is the first 2-player fighting game produced by Nintendo. It invented the idea of evading, like leaning away from attacks. Oh. Players have a stamina meter instead of health that depletes. There is no jumping or ducking. And it is actually inspired by the Mr. Game & Watch title Boxing or Punch-Out, depending on where you lived. And this is interesting. This is why I'm including it on this list, was this fact. The goal was to knock the player off the screen into a manhole on the ground. So is this an early Super Smash Brothers concept?
It sounds like it to me.
Yeah, I kind of like, I don't know. This is me putting that together. I did not read that. I did not read that like it was this early Smash concept. I just read that you knock players off the screen, and I'm like, Nintendo knocking players off the screen? This is Smash Brothers. I don't know. That's my theory anyway. All right, I hope I'm saying this right. Shusei Azumo is the next game. It is developed by Technos Japan in 1984. It's an arcade game, and it's important because it is the first sumo wrestling game. So that was neat. That's really the only fact there. Another Champion Boxing. It's a game called Champion Boxing. It's developed by Sega in 1984, and it came out on the Sega SG-1000 and the arcades and on the MSX. And this was Yu Suzuki's first fighting game. And it's important to mention this because he would later go on to create Virtua Fighter, which is the beginning of another fighting generation as far as fighting games go. Because we're going to do this pre-Street Fighter 2 era, the Street Fighter 2 era, and then the 3D fighting, like Virtua Fighter era. So he kind of kicked off the third era of fighting games. So I felt like it would be important to include this. Yeah,
Virtua Fighter wasn't his first rodeo.
No, it was not. But this was one of his first games. And it's notable because it means, hey, you know, he was doing fighting games. This is over 10 years before Virtua Fighter would come out.
Very impressive.
Very impressive. All right. The last game we're going to talk about today is a very, very famous game that I'm pretty sure most people have heard of here, and it is Punch-Out!, and that's 2 exclamation points at the end of it. This was developed by Nintendo R&D 3. It was released in Japan on February 17th, 1984, North America in March 1984, and Europe in July of 1984. It is an arcade game first. There's a lot more versions of it. We'll talk about those later. It's probably one of the most famous early fighting games. You play as a boxer in the 1984 version, not named Little Mac. You are just unnamed. That wouldn't come until a later iteration of the game. And you box against increasingly more difficult opponents. Once you beat all of them, the game repeats and it increases in difficulty. And this is actually from the perspective of through the player. Like the player character is actually a wireframe, so you can see through them. The screen is vertical, which was actually a unique thing for a game mechanic in arcade games at the time. And the funnest fact of this whole thing is Shigeru Miyamoto designed the characters.
Oh.
Yeah, so you might ask yourself, hey, why did they make a boxing game? at this time? Well, it turns out that after the success of Donkey Kong, Nintendo had a ton of extra video monitors because they actually overestimated how many monitors they would need for Donkey Kong. So Nintendo essentially proposed to the dev team like, hey, make a game that uses 2 monitors so we can get rid of all these monitors. And they actually chose to make a boxing game because that utilized the ability to zoom in and out of an object, which they thought would be cool to kind of like the punches look kind of 3D, even though they're not.
That's cool, though.
Yeah, and this was a feature more commonly found in games that involve like flying, like flight simulators, but developers chose boxing because they thought it would be like a different way to implement the use of 2 screens. And 2 screens, by the way, were not the only technological advancement at this time, because they didn't know how to store the game. They thought of doing it on a laser disc or a tape, but in the end, they used this new fancy microchip technology, you know? I wonder if we'll use those later on in our lives.
Maybe, maybe not.
And this way, they got the game running the way they wanted to and have it be high tech and stuff. So this included background animations, actually, and that amazing theme song that we all know and love. I love the Punch-Out theme song. Like, if they didn't use microchips, they couldn't do the background animations and they couldn't do the theme song. And it would just be a whole different game. Because that theme song, by the way, which I always called the Punch-Out theme when I searched for it in YouTube to amp myself up to wake up in the morning or whatever I do, is actually called the Gillette Look Sharp March. That's right. The Punch-Out theme is a jingle for the Gillette Shaving Company.
Really? Wow, I never knew that.
Yeah, it was originally heard in Gillette's radio and TV commercials. And yeah, it was also used as a theme song for the Gillette Cavalcade of Sports, which was like a sponsored thing that would air before boxing matches. So that's why they used it in Punch-Out. I just assumed it was the Punch-Out theme, but no. Gillette, shaving.
Not even close.
Not even close. Another fun thing about Punch-Out is you can actually see Mario, Luigi, Donkey Kong, and Donkey Kong Jr. all appear in the audience when you're fighting at different times, if you're looking out for
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, Punch-Out is just a huge game that kind of really popularized boxing and fighting in general. And I think it's one of the ones that, even though it wasn't from the side-by-side perspective and it was through the player, it's still like one of those games that, like, I remember Punch-Out for NES. You know, like a lot of people do. And it's a very big game. So yeah, I thought it would be a good one to cap the end of this list on today. There are so many more games. Like, yes, could I have fit them all in an episode? But that's just a lot of time and a lot of things to go through. And I'd rather, you know, this list is already pretty quick. Like, take our time and go through these. So now then, Tyler, what you been playing?
Oh, well, this week is another sort of disappointing week for this. I put a little bit more time into Persona Strikers. Not a lot, though. I put a small amount of time into Mass Effect Legendary Edition, but I'm planning on starting over pretty soon because I think we were going to try to do sort of a tandem playthrough.
I want to watch you play it.
Yeah. So I just was poking around in there just to kind of see how the first game felt because I know they made a lot of changes to the first one. It seems cool. But other than that, I really haven't been playing that many games because this week was a pretty rough work week for me, and I had to spend a lot of time getting things together. So, and then next week I'm taking a trip to my parents' house, so I may not get as much game time in. I may get more game time in than I think, but I can't plan for it. So, I don't know what I'll be able to contribute to that conversation. So I'm sorry, I haven't played a whole lot of games. But what have you been playing, Mike?
Well, that's okay. I mean, we all go through our ups and downs playing games, but this week was kind of a lighter week for me too. But I did pick up Smash Brothers again, Smash Brothers Ultimate, and I spent about like 3 hours just playing through and unlocking characters because I did some Googling, and the way you unlock characters in Smash Brothers is by time, it turns out. So the easiest thing I found to do is, originally I wasn't going to play the Spirit mode, the adventure mode, but I found out if I just set a timer on my phone for 10 minutes and play the Spirit mode for 10 minutes and then leave it, and save it and leave it, I always get a new incoming fighter. So it's technically the most like productive way to unlock characters on Smash Brothers. And I started liking it. Originally, I didn't like the spirits mode in adventure. And I was like, what is this? Like, there's like all this like weird, I don't want to say it's like Pokemon mechanics, but you have these spirits that are like, you can level up and they fight, then they give you buffs essentially. And it's just like really confusing. But the more now I'm like getting into it, and there's like a rock, paper, scissors mechanic with it where like the red one is weak to the blue one and the blue one's weak to the green one and so on and so forth. So I'm enjoying it. And I actually probably unlocked about like 15 or 20 more characters, kind of. And that also includes me forgetting to set an alarm and timer and then playing for like 20 minutes instead of like 10 minutes, which is funny. But I unlocked a lot of characters that way. It was really fun. I might keep doing that. I played some Destiny. The Vault of Glass came out, but I haven't
came out this weekend, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Weekend, I haven't looked anything up about it really. And I also am just kind of playing the seasonal content each week and then kind of putting it down. Like Iron Banner was this week, and I was just kind of like, I don't care. Like, I just don't want to sit and grind this out. And so, but yeah. And I'm also going out of town next week. So this is kind of important. We mentioned last week that we're doing a mailbag episode this coming week. This episode will come out on a Monday. If you want to send us an email to read on the next mailbag podcast, you should send us that email before Wednesday. So if you're listening to this now, that is Wednesday, May 26th, 2021. That is the last day you should send us an email, because then we'll be able to catch it and read it on the show. But yeah, so...
Yeah, and if you're listening to this in the future, hi from the past.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
I'm just saying hi to you if you're listening to this from the future. If that date has already passed for you, sorry.
Yeah, and we're probably playing more video games now. We have more time, which is nice. Hopefully. So yeah, but other than that, we got a new review. I got to read this new review. You should stall for time while I get my phone.
Oh, okay.
Do it. Stall, do it.
Yeah. No, I can totally stall for time while Mike goes and finds his phone. So yeah.
And
so
I'm back.
Yes, I did it.
You did such a good job. Okay. This is from Twill19899. Great podcast, 5 stars. I'm a pretty nerdy guy and loved video games growing up. While doing some chores around the house and browsing for a new podcast to listen to, I discovered Codex. I've been binge listening this since. Then it's that good. The podcast rekindled my love of games. Definitely worth listening to if you like video games at all. Thank you so much, Twill19899.
That's very nice of you to say.
It's very nice. You've got 120 ratings now. That's crazy. What a great time. Yeah, it's nuts. But yeah, I think that's the episode for this week. Kind of a shorter one, but I'm happy we're getting to fighting games. We will go into way more detail when we get to like the big ones, like the Street Fighters, the Mortal Kombats, Tekkens, etc. But for this early days episode, these games, like, I'm going to sound mean here. A lot of these games are really bad. Okay, just as in
they don't hold up.
They don't hold up. They're very simple. I'm happy they exist, and they each did something cool that made the genre what it is today, which is neat and why I want to address the time. But I know that people would rather listen to me talk about like Tekken or Mortal Kombat than talk about Sword Fight at Midnight, as cool as the name of the game is. Okay.
Yeah.
There's other things to talk about. So we're going to get
lots
through
of
these.
points for rhyming in your name, if you ask me.
That's right. Exactly. So we'll keep going through these in a part 2 soon-ish, probably. And then I'll start kind of diving into the actual series that people probably want me to talk about, which is your Mortal Kombat, your Tekken, Street Fighter, etc. Smash Brothers. We can talk about Smash Brothers, which I'm excited to talk about because I have a lot of time in the first Super Smash Brothers for Nintendo 64. That game I put so much time into.
Great game.
And I'm excited to talk about it. So, yeah. But with that, I don't think there's anything else. Tyler, oh wait, you can follow us on Twitter at SneakerElf, ELPH for Tyler, or at MeColetta. If you go to my Twitter profile, on the pinned page, there's also, the pinned post is the link to our Discord, if you'd like to join our Discord. And we talk about fun stuff in there like food, and people show pictures of their animals, and we play games together. We've been playing Super Smash Brothers Ultimate, and so it's fun. If you want to join that, I encourage you to do so. You can email us at codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. We're not going to dox you at gmail.com. So I think that pretty much covers it. Tyler, do you want to say bye to everybody?
Yeah. Goodbye, everybody.